In the American elegiac tradition, the landscape is a primary participant in the negotiation of grief. We see this tension clearly where static human artifacts collide with the dynamic, corrosive elements of a winter landscape. To understand how this mechanism works, we are going to conduct a structural and ontological analysis of Michael Eugene Cantrall's poem, Old Mountain Town Cemetery in Snow. Cantrall positions his work in a space where nature is not a passive backdrop. The environment itself acts as an active force, compelling the living to reckon with loss. By localizing the text within a frigid, high-altitude cemetery, the poem literalizes a dual process. The freezing temperatures preserve the physical artifacts of the past, while the harsh weather guarantees their eventual erasure. We will dissect this process by moving systematically, from the visceral sensory experience down into its syntactic mechanics, and finally its unresolved interpretive ambiguities. Before we can dismantle the poem's linguistic architecture, we must first establish a phenomenological baseline and experience the work in its entirety without interruption. As you listen, pay attention to the friction between objects in motion and objects in decay. The faded photo of a Navy officer twirls on a string and salutes the dark as a neighbor silently waits for another visit with mother and brother, when plows claw the ice out from roads down below, where frosty red, white, and blue flags fly from last July, slapped and whipped by a specter-driven gust that bends and spins around a choir of witness trees, and bric-a-brac adorns hundreds of sites where bones still sleep, and the hearts of mortal clocks, frozen by the icy winds of fate, await whispers from the master of the infinite bliss, where those within this walk absorb the fear of thought, the thought that the rest appears unending. Deep in winter's echoes with their last goodbyes, those reposed in peace parked below infinity's wink wait for the talks with those who sigh when visiting this old mountain town cemetery in snow. Cantrall constructs this somber atmosphere through a meticulously engineered linguistic architecture. We can isolate the mechanics of this poem by examining its inciting image, a faded photo of a Navy officer twirling on a string. This diagram maps the poem's objects. On the left, we see the static artifacts, the photo, the bric-a-brac, the sleeping bones. These function as failing memento mori, colorful, defiant human objects meant to memorialize the dead. On the right, the environment. The snowplows claw, flags are slapped, the wind whips. The text forces these two columns to collide. Cantrall places the vibrant red, white, and blue of military flags, symbols of vitality and purposeful action, directly into the monochromatic, bleaching dominance of the frost. This friction between the fading flags and the encroaching frost grounds the reader in the somber, tactile reality of the cemetery. The sensory conflict literalizes a biological battle. The artifacts of human existence are attempting to hold their ground against the reclaiming power of the elements. This conflict extends below the visual imagery and into the auditory mechanics of the words themselves. Consider the hard plosive consonants in a phrase like plow's claw. These sharp, heavy sounds demand physical effort from the speaker, mirroring the mechanical labor of cemetery maintenance. This waveform shows the contrast in the soundscape. The top tracks those sharp plosives. The bottom tracks the abrasive sibilants in specter-driven gust. The repeating S sounds physically mimic the continuous whistling of the mountain wind. Scaling up from phonetics to syntax, the poem uses anaphora, the repeated introductory words where and, to build a steady rhythm of inevitable return. That the most sophisticated linguistic tool at work here is anadiplosis, the repetition of the last word of a preceding line at the exact beginning of the next. Look at lines 11 and 12. Absorb the fear of thought, the thought that the rest appears unending. The line ends on a specific concept, and the next line is trapped by it. Cantrall uses anadiplosis as structural mimicry. By forcing the syntax to fold back on itself, the text physically pushes the reader's cognitive process into a loop, simulating the obsessive, inescapable repetition of human mourning. We can track the author's intent to build this tone by examining the public edit history, which reveals a systematic deepening of the poem's elegiac weight. This comparison tracks a critical revision to line 13,
Originally drafted as winter unending, the phrase was struck and replaced with winter's echoes. The shift to echoes reframes the environment as a sonic archive, reverberating with the sounds of past grief. A second major revision occurs in line 10. The author replaces the phrase eternal bliss with infinite bliss. The distinction between these two words is severe. Eternal carries familiar, comforting religious connotations. Infinite, however, is a mathematical property. It describes a cold and unfeeling cosmic vastness. These specific edits demonstrate a deliberate strategy to strip away traditional spiritual comfort. The text isolates the fragile human subject entirely, leaving them exposed beneath an indifferent universe. Identifying the true observer is the central analytical problem of the poem. Who is doing the talking, and who is actually waiting in the cemetery? This flowchart illustrates our first interpretive model, psychological projection. The living neighbor projects their grief onto the silent graves. But consider a second model, environmental agency. The text suggests the dead and the witness trees possess literal agency, actively waiting for the living. The poem refuses to confirm either model. It builds evidence for both, actively resisting a singular, definitive interpretation. For literary scholars, this intentional ambiguity is the masterstroke of the elegy. By denying a fixed perspective, the poem traps the reader in a state of unresolved uncertainty. This unresolved state sets up the ultimate conceptual collision of the text, the linear timeline of humanity against the cyclical timeline of the universe. Cantrall describes hearts as mortal clocks. This metaphor frames mortality as a biological countdown, a fragile, mechanical rhythm inevitably frozen by the elements. Set against the intimacy of those mortal clocks is the vast, unfeeling scale of infinity's wink, looking down on the cemetery. The cosmic irony is sharp. Human grief is immensely heavy to the individual experiencing it, yet the infinite universe registers the entire cycle of life and death with a brief clinical acknowledgement. Cantrall engineers this elegiac atmosphere without relying on vague emotion. Through rigorous mechanical deconstruction and a deliberate manipulation of perspective, the poem leaves the viewer to confront their own fragile ontology in the snow.